This lesson is going to be going over the histology of bone tissue. So we're going to draw on what you learned in histology regarding osseous tissue, talking about the cells, fibers, and ground substance of that bone tissue. And then we'll compare what the histology of spongy versus compact bone looks like, as well as the two different types of bone marrow. Osteogenic cells are stem cells that develop from embryonic mesenchyme and then give rise to most other bone cell types. They occur in the endosteum and inner layer of the periosteum. These osteogenic cells, as the name implies, osteo means bone, genic means to create. These are the only cells that are going to do mitosis. They multiply continually, and some of those multiplied cells will go on to become an osteoblast. Osteoblasts are then going to build the bone. The osteogenic cells, those are the only cells that are capable of doing mitosis and producing more bone cells. Once they do differentiate and they become a unipotent cell like the osteoblast, it will lose the ability to do mitosis, and all osteoblasts will have to come from those osteogenic stem cells. The osteoblasts are the bone-forming cells within the endosteum and those inner layers of the periosteum. They will synthesize soft organic matter of the matrix and promote mineralization. Remember, mineralization is going to harden that organic matter. That is called osteogenesis. And stress will stimulate the osteogenic stem cells to multiply very rapidly and produce more osteoblasts. Then those osteoblasts will go in and build more bone, further reinforcing the bone. Osteoblasts are these guys here. If we look at this histological image, you can see the bone matrix, and there is some lacuna that are housing mature osteocytes we'll talk about in a few minutes. And then we have the osteoblasts that are going to line the inner lining of the bone known as the endosteum. So these are those osteoblasts here. And then some more osteoblasts. And these are going to be the guys that build bone, laying down that bone matrix and those collagen fibers and promoting ossification and mineralization of that bony matrix. As those osteoblasts build that bone matrix, they're going to surround themselves and they will become trapped in their own secretions. Once they do, they will differentiate and turn into an osteocyte. These osteocytes are mature bone cells that will remain in the bone tissue and maintain the metabolism of bone daily. They will exchange nutrients and waste, and these osteocytes will have these projections on them so they can actually communicate with one another in order to maintain that bone tissue. And once again, these cells do not do mitosis, only those osteogenic cells. Osteocytes are former osteoblasts that have become embedded in the matrix that they have deposited. They number about 90 to 95% of the bone cells, and they live for decades within that bone tissue. This is a great image here showing the space that they live in called the lacuna. And those lacuna are interconnected by these slender little channels called canaliculi. And those are going to connect lacuna to lacuna and the osteocyte that lives in each lacuna. These canaliculi will also end up going to the center of what's called an osteon, where there is a blood vessel. So nutrients will diffuse from this blood vessel to each lacuna and to the osteocyte that is inside of it. These osteocytes have these cytoplasmic processes that reach through the canaliculi, and they can contact the processes of neighboring cells. And gap junctions will allow for the passage of nutrients and cell signals. So the cells within these lacuna can communicate with one another as they maintain that bone tissue. And the nutrients can travel from that blood vessel to each of those cells, and nutrients can then be used, and waste products can also diffuse out and get back into the blood vessel. Some osteocytes are going to help function in the daily metabolism of reabsorbing bone, while others are going to be more involved with the osteoblasts that deposit it. And some of these osteocytes will act as strain sensors. So when stresses get put on bone, these osteocytes will detect that, and they will produce biochemical signals that will regulate bone remodeling, which will form additional bone along lines of stress, changing the shape and density of the bone. These osteoblasts and osteocytes secrete a hormone called osteocalcin as part of your body's acute stress response. The cells will release this hormone, and that hormone will stimulate the pancreas to release the hormone insulin. This osteocalcin will also increase the body's sensitivity to respond to the insulin that the pancreas is releasing. And osteocalcin also promotes energy availability. The last type of bone cell is an osteoclast. These are bone dissolving cells that are going to be located on the surface of the bone. They will perform osteolysis. If you break down that word, osteo means bone, lysis means to dissolve. So this is breaking down or dissolving of bone. And this is a part of normal bone remodeling. Your skeletons were replaced about every 7 years. So the osteoclast performing osteolysis and the osteoblasts doing osteogenesis is a normal part of bone development. These osteoclasts are going to develop from a different type of bone marrow stem cell, though. So the origin is different from the other bone cells. They will develop from the mesenchyme stem cell line that gives rise to blood cells. And these cells, osteoclasts, are really, really large. They come from the fusion of several stem cells, and usually will have multiple nuclei, like 3 to 4, but they can have up to 50. There's going to be on the bottom part of the cell, which comes into contact with the bone matrix, these enfoldings called a ruffled border that increase the surface area of these cells. And often we're going to find them residing in pits called resorption bays. because that is where bone is getting broken down and it's being resorbed back into the blood as these osteoclasts etch into the bone's surface. So osteoclasts are those bone dissolving cells, and their action is called osteolysis, which is the opposite of osteogenesis. And you can see this resorption bay that's being created from the bone resorption right along that ruffled border. So these cells are going to develop from the same bone marrow stem cell as our blood cells, and therefore these guys do not undergo mitosis. They are going to come from the fusion of the bone marrow stem cells. Here is showing several stem cells that are fusing to form each osteoclast, and so they are going to be unusually large, having typically 3 to 4 nuclei, but again can have many more. And this image shows the osteoclast residing in that pit referred to as the resorption bay that is formed as the osteoclast etches into the bone as it does resorption, right? So this image here is showing an osteoclast, while up at the top of the figure we have the osteogenic cell that is forming and differentiating into an osteoblast that is going to build bone during osteogenesis. And then once that osteoblast surrounds itself in that bone matrix, it's going to differentiate and turn into an osteocyte, or it will have those dendritic projections that reach through the canaliculi to a neighboring osteocyte, where they will reside for decades and maintain that bone tissue. The matrix of osseous tissue is that stony matter that surrounds the osteocytes and lacuna. By dry weight, the matter is consistent of about 1/3 organic matter and about 2/3 of inorganic matter. So the organic matter are going to be the things that are made by the osteoblast, like the ground substance and the collagen fibers. Any proteins like glycoaminoglycans and proteoglycans and glycoproteins, right? Things that are made by the cells, the osteoblasts or the osteocytes. While the inorganic matter is going to be the mineral component, which is going to be the hardened portion. What makes up the majority of the crystal component of the bone is called hydroxyapatite. That is crystallized calcium phosphate salts, and a small component is going to be about 10% calcium carbonate. And then there's going to be about 5% of inorganic ions. And several foreign elements can behave chemically like these bone minerals and become incorporated into osseous tissue as contaminants, sometimes with deadly results. For example, when Marie and Pierre Curie and Henri Becquerel received their Nobel Prize for the discovery of radioactivity, it was not for several decades that anyone even realized it was dangerous. Factories once employed women to paint luminous numbers on watches and clock dials with radium paint. The women would moisten the paintbrushes with their tongues and to keep them with a fine point. Well, as they did that, they ingested radium in the process. The radium then accumulated inside of these women's bones and caused many to develop bone cancer called osteosarcoma. And history remembers these women as the radium girls. It is a, sorry, tangent over. It is a combination, though, of the organic portion that's going to provide protection against like twists, and the inorganic portion, which is going to provide protection against compression, that will give bone an ability to be flexible and strong. The collagen and the minerals working together, the collagen being part of the organic portion and the minerals being part of the inorganic portion, are going to form a composite material that gives bone this combination of flexibility and strength. The minerals will enable the bone to support the weight of the body without sagging. When the bones are deficient in those minerals like calcium salts, they are then soft and bend easily. If you were to soak a clean, dry bone like a chicken bone in vinegar for a few days, the acid in the vinegar will dissolve the minerals and the bone becomes flexible and rubbery. This is similar to the mineral deficiency and flexibility that are the central problems in childhood diseases like rickets, in which the soft bones of the lower limbs bend under the body's weight and become permanently deformed or bow-legged. Without the organic portion, without that protein, the bone is excessively brittle because the protein component is going to give the bone a degree of flexibility. Without collagen, a jogger's bones would shatter under the impact of running. But normally, when a bone bends slightly near one side, the tensile strength of the collagen fibers on the opposite side holds the bone together and prevents it from snapping like a stick of chalk. Collagen molecules have sacrificial bonds that break under stress, protecting a bone from fracture by dissipating some of the shock. These bonds will reform when the collagen is relieved of stress. Bone also has a degree of variability in one place to another. It is a living tissue. So its ratio of minerals to collagen will vary in place to place. For example, we have the bones of the middle ear. Those are about 90% mineral, giving them the necessary stiffness to efficiently conduct sound vibrations to the inner ear, while the limb bones will have a higher percentage of collagen so they can bend slightly under the body's weight. Osseous tissue is adapted to different amounts of tension and compression exerted on different parts of the skeleton. The histology.